I've been looking forward to this next presentation. We got Grad Conn, CMO and Chief Experience Officer from Sprinklr. Sprinklr with a
Yeah, Sprinklr. It's we couldn't afford the E, so it's just LR.
Well, we'll all chip in.
Got to be economical in a startup.
Buy a vowel.
No, vowels are really expensive.
I know they're expensive. And once again, for our audience,
so
yeah, we can get questions as we go through this. But I'm going to turn it over to you, Grad. You get a question, or at least something that's near and dear to my heart and many people is, we talk about going where the money is. Marketing is important. Customers are important, and driving business with advanced analytics, and it's a big challenge right now. So I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you walk us through.
Great, thanks, Jim. So over the next half hour, I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to really talk a little bit about how things are changing from a customer engagement, and there's a marketing element to this, but there's a customer care element to this. And at the end of the day, companies run on customers. So if something's changing in the customer world and something's changing in the organizations that serve them. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to land a couple of mindset shifts on the audience as we go through this. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm widely available across the interwebs. So hit me however you want to. I'm on all the platforms, and you can DMs on Twitter are very good. LinkedIn is extremely good. But you can also text me directly. So there is a daily podcast that we do at Sprinklr, and when I say we, it's mostly me. And so feel free to listen to that. You can get the podcasting platforms, and many of the concepts that I'm talking about today are talked about at length in the more than 150 episodes we've got now on the Unified CXM experience. So I don't know if you noticed, but things have been changing quickly in the 21st century. And so I want to go through how customer engagement is changing. Super quick history lesson. I'm not going to bore you too much with the 19th century, but I want to make a point that, in the 19th century, selling was a very personal process. It was one-to-one. You knew who you were buying from. You knew who you were selling to. It was one-to-one, face-to-face, highly identified, what we would tend to call personalized advertising today. Then we invented a pile of new broadcast tools in the 20th century, which were used for both good and evil in the 20th century. But, think about all the stuff we think about today: radio, mass magazines, television, theater, movie theaters, all that stuff all came up in the 20th century and led to this sort of golden era of marketing where suddenly a very small number of people could communicate with a large group of people. It was amazing, and lots of great brands were created as a result. It had one problem in that it was anonymous. So we would do things as mass marketers, like create personas and come up with sort of fake ways of thinking of who we're talking to. It's very hard to understand whether people were reacting to it. So we would do studies and focus groups and things like that. This is how I started my career at Procter & Gamble. So great in many ways, but had some real disadvantages. And the 21st century is an amazing time. I was always jealous of my dad. He was a madman on Madison Avenue, and I always thought he lived in the best time for marketing, but I don't think so. I think it's now because we actually have one-to-one back again. I can now know who someone is, and I can know their interests, and I can do that at mass scale. It's quite an amazing time. There's a subtlety or nuance in this diagram, which is not only can companies have a two-way connection to consumers, but they're connected to each other. So this mass network effect is creating a lot of important issues that companies need to be aware of. And so we're in this new era, which is mass and one-to-one. And this term, mass one-to-one, was actually coined by Mark Pritchard, who's the chief brand officer at Procter & Gamble. They're doing this. They're a big customer of ours. We do a lot of stuff with them. And some of the things that P&G is doing to kind of move into this new era are pretty exciting. It is a big mindset shift. And it's not to be trivialized. Like the idea of thinking about broadcast, which is really telling people what to think, versus conversation, which is interacting with people iteratively, is very different. And even the way it happens, right? In a mass marketing context, what we would tend to do is do research, digest the research. I remember doing studies at P&G that would last a year, right? Last a year doing segmentation research. And then from that, build a set of insights that would then generate some advertising that we would blast out to people. Today, someone says something, you need to answer that like a few minutes later. It's a completely different way of thinking about things. And customers expect us to talk to them like we know them because they know we do. right? So think of mass one-to-one as a read-write system. We're reading what people are saying, and we've got to write right back to them. This is Tom over at Verizon. This was a quote from maybe a week ago. But what he's finding is that consumers are expecting us to know what they're consuming, and the concerns of a few years ago are kind of going away. They don't seem that freaked out anymore. They really want to know that you know them and you can personalize things to them. So the voice of the customer today, and where you learn all this stuff, is on social channels. And the shift to social has been pretty profound. This is a chart from Mary Meeker showing, and the kind of the punchline on this is kind of amazing, showing the move from synchronous connections like the phone in the bottom right-hand corner to asynchronous connections like social in the top left-hand corner. And the amazing thing about this is this chart is from 2019. So can you only imagine what this shift looks like now? And so our consumers are moving to these new channels, these 21st century channels, and they're communicating in an asynchronous way because they're online all day in really cool sessions like this. So you got to be able to do two things at once. So the foundation of mass one-to-one, the foundation of this whole new shift, is social. And the challenge, and this is non-trivial, the challenge is that social is exponentially more complex than the traditional channels that it's replacing. Putting a 30-second TV ad on 3 networks. Now, I'm going back a few years there, but that wasn't that hard. I mean, it seemed hard at the time, but it really wasn't that hard in comparison to the 25 social platforms, the thousands of pieces of content, multiple business units. Like there's a complexity in this world we live in now that is sort of more significant than the ability of the human mind to manage it. And so I'll be talking about AI in a second. And the way that many of us and many organizations have managed this complexity is we've ignored it. There are actually companies I meet all the time who say the way we manage social is we don't allow anyone to read it. I'm like, okay, how does that work? Like you're just really like literally letting the phone ring. Like you're just ignoring your customers completely. And increasingly that's just not acceptable because too many companies and organizations are now doing this and getting in there, and so everyone has to manage it. So we just can't ignore this new reality anymore. So that's kind of the setup, and hopefully that you sort of get my perspective. And implications of it would be things like personas, which I lived in a persona-driven world for many years as a mass marketer. They're meaningless. It doesn't matter what someone's persona is. What matters is what they're doing. And we can see what they're doing and we can tell what they're doing. If someone's buying a new house, they generally talk about it. And it doesn't matter what their demographics are. What matters is their action. And if I'm in house insurance, I want to be able to sell insurance to them, and I want to be if I can see that action now and I can market against it. So there's this now, because of this, there's this new emerging field called CXM. So I want to just define that quickly. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes making sure there's clarity here. Because there are a lot of acronyms flying around as we evolve very quickly as an industry, and so I'm going to spend a minute on that, just making sure that that's clear, and then I'll go into some detail on how you actually execute and make mass one-on-one happen as a reality. So there are 3 foundational principles of CXM. Very conveniently, they are named after the 3 initials of CXM. So there's the customer, right? The customer is critical in a CXM context. And there's a question, do you approach your business from the perspective of the customer? And some sort of questions below to think about it. There's experience, and the key concept here is, do you respect the time of your customers? When people get upset about a customer service issue or about a company experience, they're upset about the fact that their time was wasted. Time has become extremely valuable to people. And as we do more and more asynchronously, time becomes increasingly more valuable because we can do more with the time we have. So if you've noticed that feeling that you're this tension of, I don't want to waste any time, it's because your time literally is more valuable because you can do more with it. When it took an entire day's buggy ride to get to town, time became less valuable because it took a long time to do things. When you can do 25 things in the course of a half hour, then time becomes something that you really value. And people are willing to pay companies more when they respect their time. And then finally, management, which is, do you actually respond to your consumers? Which, I mean, in some ways is almost a ridiculous statement, that the fact that people are actually ignoring it. But I can show you thousands and thousands and thousands of examples, maybe even millions of examples of people crying out for companies to get back to them and to talk to them and engage with them, and they don't. And this is like, it's not going to be acceptable in the future, and it's increasingly not acceptable now. There's a voice of the customer infused in all of these. And then let me talk now a little bit about sort of the different types of platforms that are out there. So if you think about CRM systems and Salesforce, that does a great job on understanding the customer that you have right now. I'll spend a bit more on that in a second. If you think about systems like Qualtrics, called experience management systems usually, they're great at understanding the customer and the experience the customers had. So they report on how that went. And systems like Sprinklr, which is where I work, and I was Sprinklr's first customer. So I've been working with Sprinklr for more than 10 years now. It actually understands the customer, the experience, and then allows you to actually respond to the customer directly. So it's a read-write system. Right. So this is, and these are actually all complementary systems that work together, not competitive, but sometimes there's some confusion on whether there's differentiation here. So let me talk a little bit about how CRM is different from CXM, and building on that last slide, and then I'll do the same thing for XM in a second. So CRM, customer relationship management, pretty familiar with this category, and CXM, customer experience management. This is what I'm going to do a quick comparison of. So in CRM, the people in the system are the people that you know. In CXM, these are the people that know me. So it's different sides of the same coin. People I know versus people that know me. In CRM, it shows the organization what the customer looks like, right? So it's the inside view of a customer, what a customer looks like to the organization. In CXM, it's what the organization looks like to the customer. So how I'm responding to you, how I'm managing you, how I'm dealing with you, that's what CXM is. And so interestingly, they both have people we know in them, but in CXM, it also could include people we don't know. People who are not actually doing anything with us right now, but may be talking to us. CRM typically is structured data, which has been solicited. CXM is unstructured data that's unsolicited, coming from all the different kinds of networks that are out there, comments and blogs and reviews and newsletters and everything else that's out there. And we'll talk about this more, but these are hundreds of millions of data sources. So there are two sort of players in this space, Salesforce and Sprinklr. Typically work very closely together because they're complementary systems, and there are many examples of where we work together well, and I'll provide one a bit later. XM is another growing category right now, Qualtrics being sort of the leading player in that space, and that's experience management. And we'll compare it to CXM again. So in XM, it's often like your store layout is confusing. That's what you can learn that with XM. Whereas in CXM is people want to talk to you one-to-one, completely different. So XM really illustrates the customer experience to the organization and focuses on measurement and process improvement. Whereas in CXM, what happens is you can connect the customer to your organization. So it enables one-to-one direct customer engagement. So these are one-to-one conversations and personalized advertising. The other way of thinking about it is XM has got lag, right? And both CRM and XM have lag, and that's not a criticism. It's just that's a reality of a system that's reporting. And CXM is meant to be and is most effective when it's real time. I put my hand up, I say I'm sad about something that the company did to me, and the company gets back to me 5 minutes later and makes it better. That's CXM in action. XM is generally private data from internal systems, and once again, of course, CXM is this public data that we're talking about. So, and again, complementary systems work well together. Qualtrics works well, sitting there optimizing process improvement all the time. In CXM, often many of the things that people are talking about are surfaced, they're dealt with immediately, and then they can feed into Qualtrics. And we're a feeder system for Qualtrics in lots of different places. So I'm talking a little bit about Sprinklr, and obviously that's where I work. But how does Sprinklr work? And I want to go through sort of the three sort of stages of how Sprinklr works, and this will also lead me into sort of an interesting discussion of how important AI is in the world that we live in. Just as a quick teaser, Sprinklr sits on 15 petabytes of this public data, conversational data, and so it's made for a very rich AI experience. So if you know Sprinklr at all, you're probably familiar with our social media management background. We started on the social platforms, and all the social platforms are connected to us via API, so we can read from them and write to them. So, called publishing often, and listening. Those kind of listening and publishing are kind of words used in the industry. But we also are connected to all the messaging platforms, which have become a very popular way for people to interact with companies. Forums are becoming extremely important, and I would suggest that Reddit may be one of the most important sources of information for some types of companies out there. Certainly our technology clients like Oracle and Cisco and Dell and people like that, Reddit is a critical channel that they work really well to understand. And then blogs, there's 500 million blogs out there. There's a lot of review sites. There's a lot of newsletters. Comments themselves, comments are incredibly rich sources of conversation and feedback and input for companies. And then more recently, over the last couple of years, because we had kind of pulled all this stuff together, a number of our customers were saying, can you just do all channels so I can just use Sprinklr to see all my earned media everywhere? So we added TV, radio, newspapers, and magazines. About 400 million different data sources flow into Sprinklr. So it's a very rich incoming data source. So that obviously creates a huge problem because it's a very rich incoming data source, and you got to be able to make sense of all this. So we started working on our first AI, actually with my team at Microsoft, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Microsoft, we had an interesting challenge with our products because we had, in our wisdom, named them after common objects, Surface and Windows and Office. And my favorite one to find was Word. It's really tricky, right? So, and someone might say, I need to clean the windows on my Office. It had nothing to do with us. Someone else might say, I need to clean Office off my Windows, and that had everything to do with us, and certainly something we would want to interact with. So we worked really hard with Sprinklr to kind of work on this first stage of discovery. Are they actually talking to us? A huge client of ours is Apple. Apple, $1 trillion brand, very important global brand. Most people are familiar with it. Also, a delicious fruit. And sometimes people are talking about eating apples, and sometimes people are talking about Apple eating their homework. And so you've got to be able to differentiate between that as well. The second thing, and this is where we've spent a lot of our time over the last 5 years, is once you know that they are talking to you, what is the intent of the message? The intent. Intent is critical because if you're sad or happy, or if you have a question, or if you need help, those are all really important things for me to understand, because I'm going to route you differently inside of my organization to make sure you get the advice or help you need as quickly as possible. So I'll show you an example of that with Samsung in a second. And then finally, and this has been more recent, probably the last 4 years, is once we've routed it correctly, you need to increase agent productivity. And as these channels have become more and more popular, and we're talking about millions and millions of customer care incidences now for some of the larger clients, they've got to be able to scale their teams. They can't just infinitely add people. And so making suggestions on how to reply to the customer that can be edited, but are based on the replies of the best agents, has become a really important part of our AI, and routing things correctly and making sure that people aren't spending time sorting and stuff like that. So all this engagement stuff's been critical. And that sort of allows us to sort of unify the engagement. Now, there's a lot of different things that people want to talk about with companies, but in a really simple world, and I don't think this is that bad, answering questions, solving problems, amplifying a positive experience, and upselling, pretty comprehensive. Now, the one thing that's missing in all this, and if you've got any kind of any toes in any of these waters, you're like, hey, yeah, but what about privacy? And what about governance? And what about security? And that is really the secret sauce of Sprinklr, which is, that's actually the reason I bought it originally, is it's a very, very robust governance structure that can drive compliance and strong workflow motions. And then we're GDPR and California Privacy Act and everything else compliant. and spend a lot of time on that. All the largest banks, our largest insurance companies, anyone who's in sort of a very privacy sensitive area are customers of Sprinklr. And being able to surround the engagement mechanism with those tools allows us to make sure that companies are able to have the correct tone of voice, say the right things, make sure they don't sort of say things that are inaccurate, and make sure they don't cross the lines when it comes to privacy. So that's essentially Sprinklr. That's kind of what it does. And if you wanted to boil this down, we listen to everything that's going on out there, we learn from that, and then we help you love your customer. And some people don't like words, so you can just turn into pictures if you want. So that's Sprinklr could be just those three things. And the way it's built is the listen, learn, love structure is essentially all the different individual point solutions that people tend to use to deliver CXM are all on a single platform in Sprinklr. So there's sort of 31 products all built by one team in one place on one platform. And so there's a unified database and platform that delivers that. And I'll give you sort of an example, and this is a good way of illustrating sort of what we do. Samsung's been a customer of ours for quite a long time. They've got about 2,700 people, about 2,000 care agents and a pile of marketers using the product in about 100 countries, almost 100 countries. And so they're using 16 of our products, and you can see that they're using a lot in the research area, which is listening. And then they have a bunch of the care stuff, because they're doing a lot of care work, and they do publishing as well. What I think is really interesting about Samsung is that they're actually listening to and pulling in 5 billion mentions, 5 billion mentions a year. Man, just the scale of this is quite shocking, right? And from those 5 billion mentions, they're handling about 12 million customer care cases in that team. They're doing it much, much faster than they used to. At much higher volumes and driving increased satisfaction with their customers. And the system that they've got is pretty cool. What they kind of worked with us on is they didn't want to have a bunch of different solutions, and they didn't want to silo the communication channels, because what they were noticing is that in this new asynchronous world, customers were not just communicating on asynchronous channels, but they were also using multiple channels. I might send an email and I might follow up with a WhatsApp, or I might call, or I might text, and I might send, put something on Twitter. Like there's a multi-channel approach that customers would have, and then they could get different replies, and that wouldn't be particularly helpful. And so the stuff that goes to the website, the app, anything that's text to Samsung, any calls, so all the IVR, and anything happening across social and messaging all flows into Sprinklr. We connect with a bunch of internal systems. I mentioned earlier that we're a feeder system for Qualtrics. In Samsung's case, they use Medallia, so we'll feed input into Medallia, plus they have some other internal systems that they've built themselves. And then our AI will route this to the correct support agent. Maybe it needs to go from pre-sales to sort of expert, so we can easily migrate to a different type of support person, or e-com and sales if it's an upsell. And so essentially, and then all those channels on the left can be surveyed with an omni-channel survey system on the right. And so we've unified across multiple teams, unified across multiple channels, and this is how Samsung is running their global customer care engagement system. And we do this for many of the world's largest companies. Dell would be another great example of this, where we do this in concert with Salesforce. And Dell is Salesforce's biggest customer, and we are about 25% of all cases are now flowing through Sprinklr, and then we do a two-way bi-directional connect to Salesforce to inform their CRM system of what's happening with the customers they know, and then do all the work that we need to do with people that they don't know yet. So I want to end with just a quick thing on AI, and we'll have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. So I've kind of hinted at the fact there's a lot of data here. This is kind of what's happening inside. So our system, in order to be able to manage this complexity and manage all the stuff that's flowing from all these channels, is doing 10 billion predictions a day, about 100 million training points, and about 50 million businesses and consumers are handled by AI per day in Sprinklr. So it's a monster AI footprint, and that's why, I think the reason our AI has gotten really strong is the training set. I mentioned earlier that we have a 15 petabyte database, and what we're basically doing is a local copy of the social and modern web. So if you ever use Sprinklr, if you're a Sprinklr user, you'll notice it's like wicked fast, and you'll get like essentially millions of responses really in a search. Well, the reason it's like that is because it's all local. And so that database allows us to train and create a pretty strong AI. People want AI, and they know, people know it's going to boost productivity. They know it's going to establish a lead over competitors. But there are some barriers to AI that we've noticed, and we've been implementing it across our whole customer base. But there is a limited AI experience in customers. Increasing complexity is making it more difficult, and there's not a lot of great tools for developing AI models. And so we've just introduced about 3 weeks ago something called Sprinklr AI Studio. And what it does is that allows you to create and train machine learning models with no code. So you can actually just go in, create and classify, validate, and then review and deploy messages. And you can actually do this with any member of your team. And they're just basically essentially saying yes and no in terms of the message validity, and allows you to actually train the model and create a stronger AI model. And all AI models that are optimized on a customer by customer basis are owned by the customer in Sprinklr's context. So the customers own the work that they do in terms of training AI. So that's a kind of a journey on the new world that we're in, how things are changing, and a little bit about Sprinklr and where we're going from a data standpoint. And hopefully you found that interesting and useful. I always do.
Fabulous. Yeah, I'm sitting here making notes as you're going through. There's some great stuff. We have some great questions, and if we try and go through them, but there's quite a few, and some of them are good. I'm going to start with a skeptic out there who says that instant question can, in principle, one-to-many be reduced to one-to-one, human-to-human interactions, but isn't it just making people believe it's personal in there?
Well, there's a lot of nuance in there. So I mean, I don't think that's a skeptic. That's a person who's like, help me understand more deeply. And I think it's a good question, actually. One nuance is that if I say Windows just bricked my machine, like if you do that, just try it. Go on Twitter and say something bad happened to you because of a Microsoft product, you'll get a one-to-one reply from Microsoft. They'll come back to you and they'll fix it. So that's mass one-to-one, right? That's why I kind of like showing the Samsung example, because those 12 million customer care cases are not a robot. They're a person getting back to someone to try to fix a problem. However, there are situations where you don't need to be one-to-one on everything. For example, advertising, right? So Disney Plus streaming service launched through Sprinklr. And in Disney's case, they had a bit of a sort of challenge in that they are a very strong brand, but it tends to be a little stereotyped. So people hear Disney Plus and they're like, I saw Cinderella. I don't need to see another cartoon again, right? But that's not what that channel is at all. It's like Marvel, it's like National Geographic, it's like an incredible library. And so what they did is they started profiling customers and said, well, what is Grad into? I'm into the space race in the 60s. What's Grad's oldest daughter into? She's into like classic Disney musicals. My youngest daughter, marine biologist. She likes the National Geographic. And they produce different ads for us depending on our interests based on what we were saying publicly. Yep. In the end, they produced about 118,000 different ad units. So technically speaking, it's not one-to-one, but when's the last time you did an ad campaign with 118,000 different creative units in it, right? And to do that and to make that happen, obviously it's not something humans can do. That's something that's AI driven. So there's a little, in that case, in terms of this, the question, yeah, that's kind of feels one-to-one because it's exactly what I'm into. But there's enough people that are also kind of sharing that interest with me that they can do it more broadly. But, in many cases, if someone's got a problem, it gets solved.
Yeah. Okay. No, and that there's a requirement that the company have a structure to solve those problems quickly. And then I think you alluded to that. If you're not listening, if you got build all this to listen, and you're not listening, you've just created a bigger problem for yourself in there. So,
and increasingly, consumers are testing companies. I want to work with companies that do listen. And if you don't respond to me, I'm not going to give you my business anymore.
Yep. No, I think that's certainly in my world. In there. So, and we may have covered this, how can you utilize unstructured marketing data to drive new insights? I think you talked a little bit about that. That's particularly the area you're in is a lot of unstructured data.
Yeah, well, I unstructured, I did use the word unstructured, just to be clear. So I'm going to contradict myself slightly here in a second. But if you really want to like kind of pull it apart, it's not really completely unstructured. It's just hard structured to understand. Like there's essentially 164 data types in the Twitter fire hose, which we pull in completely. And so it's just a lot more complicated than, one of our customers is Rolex. And currently Rolex collects first name, last name, and wrist size.
Okay.
That's it. Right. So that's pretty structured and pretty straightforward, right? If you want to have all the things that, Grad likes to do with his life and, kind of, that's a lot more there, but, it is a more complex structure. The thing is, though, it is still based on language, and language is fundamentally structured. So at the end of the day, AI essentially applies structure to these things and then allows you to then be able to see it. One thing we do a lot of is life stage marketing. So there's a lot of like people having babies, people having buying new houses, people changing jobs, people moving cities. Like those moments are great marketing and upsell moments. And so how do you make sure you identify those and get at them? And that's always very unstructured. In fact, sometimes it's just a visual. And so we do a lot of visual searches now where someone may post a picture that shows there's a baby coming when we've got a large library of this now, and we can find that and then be able to get back to them with something that's relevant.
Okay, this one maybe I don't know the terms customer CXM platform. You got and a CDP or customer data platform.
Yeah.
The relationship between those two.
So the CDP. So we work with a lot of CDPs. There's an excellent one in Adobe. And what people are doing is they're building CDPs as a data store of all this customer information. The challenge is that CDPs grew out of the CRM world. So as CRM systems proved to be not flexible enough to completely own the customer profile, and you needed to add data from other systems, like say your website, person's clicked on certain things, I want to be able to record that. So CDPs kind of grew out of that, but they still had a more heavily structured component to it. There are a number of very interesting startups in the CDP world, but some people are very nervous about putting their entire customer data store on a $12 million startup, so that's a little bit tricky. So we actually at Sprinklr have a CDP built right into Sprinklr. And so when I was actually at Microsoft, we got to about 500 million IDs in there, and some of our customers have many hundreds of millions. And so you can use the CDP wherever you want. It's just the CDP is it's a strategic piece of back-end software where you have everything in one spot that allows you to be able to know the customer fully.
Wow. Yeah. Is a strong collaboration between IT and marketing departments necessary to realize the full benefits of?
Well, that's a very wise question. That is a very wise question. And I think one of the biggest, I don't understand what happened, but I think one of the biggest mistakes of the last decade is that all these BDMs, the business decision makers and marketers, went off and thought they could build software. And I think that people got a little entranced by SaaS and APIs and thought this wasn't that hard. And if you know anything about software, it's hard. It's very hard. I've got enough humility in my own stupidity to never actually attempt that. And I've always worked really closely with the IT teams, and they will spin up, groups that might focus on MarTech. But the IT marketing partnership needs to be much stronger. I do think one of the challenges in a lot of marketing organizations is they have a lot of platforms, 91 on average, which is incredible. And that's just too hard to manage. So IT can help you bring some sense to that.
Somebody presented me with a diagram of all the MarTech software, and it just, and I'm a CIO. I looked at this and went,
you can't manage that. Yeah.
But
just provisioning a new user, you got to provision them to 91 systems, and then when they leave the company, you got to deprovision. You're leaving holes everywhere inside the company.
Yeah. Well, when you get new employees who come in, and we're not that big a company, new employees come and say, "Why do you have two systems to do this?" You go, "We what?"
Yeah, right.
And the last question, I think this is really great. Thank you. We're whipping through these in there. So how do you measure the success and ROI of these features? And I think it's really a great question in there.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it is. There's certainly many ways to measure it. I would say that Dyson's a big customer of ours, and they run Sprinklr to drive upsell. So they upsell off platforms like Facebook and Instagram, and they actually measure the revenue they're generating.
Yep.
Right. And so they just every year it's like kind of 10xing. And so that's a very straightforward way of measuring things. If you look at that Samsung example I have, they will measure customer satisfaction because they have an omni-channel survey capability built into the system that they created with us. And so there's the KPIs that you're going to build around need to be tied into the systems. But I've never run into a situation where you can't get to the KPI that you need, but I wouldn't say there's a one size fits all because every company is a bit different. In Dell's case, a lot of what Dell was looking at was this is the most interesting KPI I think I've ever run into is because Dell wasn't getting back to customers on these channels, and people were sort of spinning in the wind. What would happen is people would escalate to Michael Dell.
Yeah,
and Michael Dell, bless him, amazing executive, would respond to these things, but then would also say, hey, what's going on? How come I'm getting all these escalations? So one of their KPIs, it's not their only KPI, they've got many, but one of their KPIs, their most important one in some ways was reduce the number of escalations to Michael Dell, and they're like at 0 now, right? So they don't have any going to Michael Dell anymore, but that was like a big deal for them. So, the KPI can be different depending on the company's context.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, you got to admire a CEO answers questions.
Right.
I answer every email I get, and I think you can't stop. Last question in here because they're coming in here. But is Sprinklr a tool mostly for enterprise size companies, or could you handle small players as well? What's the size?
It's enterprise. We focus on the larger segment who have a large problem. Yeah. Right. So we're optimized for large global organizations. We're turning into a pretty large global organization ourselves because of that. But we work with sort of Fortune 1000. We're highly penetrated in that segment. 91 of the world's top 100 most valuable brands are customers of ours, and we have most of the Fortune 1000 are customers of ours. If you are a smaller organization, like say under $1 billion, it depends a little bit. Like we have a new customer of ours is Coinbase. So Coinbase is not $1 billion company, but social connections is super important to what they do and a big part of their marketing budget. So they're actually an excellent candidate for us because they actually have a lot of scale issues because of the way they're doing it. But if you're a very small business, there are other products out there that will sort of suit your needs, and Sprinklr would be too much.
Oh, this is great. We ran a little late, but the questions were great. Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure meeting you over the air, and I hope to see you again. And
thanks, Jim.
It was great. So we're going to wrap up our day, everybody. And if you got